Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on the Section 202 Supportive Housing for the Elderly Program, the FY 2018 Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFA. My name is Will Levy with the Office of Recapitalization, which is within the Office of Multifamily Housing here at HUD. On April 4th, 2019, HUD published this NOFA on grants.gov. The purpose of this webinar is to acclimate you to key program requirements. It will not be a comprehensive survey of the NOFA, but will instead provide summary level data to help you as you prepare any NOFA applications. Please make sure to refer to the full NOFA for complete guidance. Today's NOFA will cover a description of the funding opportunity, key resources that prospective applicants should rely on, an overview of NOFA requirements, an overview of the application rating factors, and of the application review and award process. Then we should have some time at the end for some Q&A. We're using a GoToWebinar to host today's webinar. Through the GoToWebinar module, you can submit questions in the box that appears on your screen, or you can ask a question live by raising your hand. You'll have to make sure that your audio is set up appropriately to do so. So again, the title of this NOFA is FY 2018 Section 202 Supportive Housing for the Elderly Program. The reference number is FR 6200 and 52. Through this NOFA, HUD is making $50 million available for the development of supportive rental housing for very low-income persons aged 62 or older. Very important, of course, the application due date is Wednesday, August 28, 2019 at midnight. We strongly recommend that folks get applications in at least 48 hours before this date, just to work out any technical issues that may arise. The eligible applicants for this NOFA are private nonprofit organizations that have tax-exempt status under Section 501c3 or Section 501c4 of the Internal Revenue Code of 1986, and nonprofit consumer cooperatives. Through this NOFA, HUD seeks to fund Section 202 properties that advance housing for the elderly as a platform for living independently and aging in community, even as residents may require more assistance with activities of daily living over time. HUD seeks to fund properties that will be at the forefront of design, service delivery, and the efficient use of federal resources, and that will provide models for replication by other providers of supportive housing for very low-income elderly persons. To meet this outcome, HUD expects successful applicants to demonstrate best practices or innovation in both physical design and supportive services. Proposals must promote the long-term physical and mental health and wellness of very low-income elderly persons and the efficient delivery of government assistance. Finally, HUD aims to provide capital advance funding to those applicants who leverage capital advance funds with other financing sources to meet the goal of building supportive housing for very low-income elderly persons. For more information about the specific rating factors, please see Section 5A of the NOFA. So specifically, the funds that will be awarded under this NOFA will serve two purposes. First, HUD provides capital advance funding for the development of supportive rental housing for very low-income persons aged 62 years or older. Funds must be used to finance construction, reconstruction, moderate or substantial rehab, or acquisition of a structure with or without rehab. Funds cannot be used to construct or operate assisted living facilities. Second part of the funding provides project rental subsidies in the form of a project rental assistance contract, or PRAC, to provide ongoing operating assistance and maintain the affordability of covered units. PRAC funds are used to cover the difference between tenants' contributions toward rent and the HUD-approved operating costs. PRAC funds may also be used to provide supportive services and to hire a service coordinator. Applicants must request in their application both a capital advance amount, at least $1, and the number of units to be assisted under the PRAC. Just to note that over the last 3 fiscal years, Congress has actually provided HUD additional funds for this purpose, a total of $160 million. This NOFA makes up to $50 million available, and a second NOFA with up to $110 million in funding will be published in calendar year 2020, after awards are made on this NOFA. Why did HUD split funds into two NOFAs? Well, HUD's not issued a Section 202 NOFA since fiscal years 2010 and 2011. With a 4-month application period, this gives limited time for sponsors to arrange applications for this NOFA. And having a 2 NOFA process allows applicants a ramp-up period because there are significant changes from this NOFA as compared to the last, including emphasis on physical design standards and on mixed finance development that leverages capital advance funding with other sources. We're hoping that by creating these 2 NOFAs, this will give applicants who need more time to develop their project proposal another predictable opportunity in which they'll be able to request funds. Just to turn now to speak to the key resources that applicants should be aware of. First, HUD's funding opportunity webpage has the NOFA itself, the Section 202 PRAC operating cost standards, which will be the initial PRAC rents that properties will have once they're built. A link to the minority concentration analysis tool, which is going to be critical when considering site and neighborhood standards, and our FAQs. On grants.gov, that's where applicants will actually submit their application and where applicants can find their form documents for submission. So those are the 2 web pages that are most critical. Any questions that potential applicants have along the way should all be emailed centrally to 202 Capital Advance NOFA at HUD.gov. And then, of course, the Section 202 regulations, which are at 24 CFR 891. Please note that during the application period, HUD is not able to provide any information that would give an applicant an advantage over another applicant. Therefore, we can provide responses on technical matters or refer readers with questions to particular parts of the NOFA. Where we find that questions come up that warrant broader clarification, we'll post them as FAQs. We'll be updating FAQs once a week on Mondays. We've posted our first FAQ today in time for this NOFA. If in any given week there are no updates, it'll just be the same set of FAQs from the previous week. When it comes time to submit, or for folks who anticipate submitting an application, it's important to register with the System for Award Management, or called SAM, and grants.gov. Registration is a multi-step process and can take up to 4 weeks, so get this started early. The applicant must have a valid DUNS number. Download both the application instructions and the application package from grants.gov. Make sure to submit the complete application electronically, unless the applicant has a good cause to submit in a hard copy. But I think it'll be easiest for most if the application can be done electronically. Just a note that you should include a copy of the cover letter sent to the state point of contact if there is a requirement for review. That's a local requirement, a statewide, state-specific requirement, so please check your state's requirements. And make sure to follow any formatting guidelines for narratives and other attachments. The application will need to include a number of stock forms, including the application for federal assistance, the previous participation certification, a disclosure of lobbying activities, the multifamily housing project, the application for multifamily housing project, or HUD Form 92013, which we're using the same form that's used for FHA insurance, but many of the forms on this field are not needed for the purposes of submitting an application under this NOFA. We'll shortly provide instructions on which fields can be ignored or not completed. Applicants will also need to submit a certification regarding lobbying and the HUD applicant recipient disclosure report. Okay, now we'll dive deeper into the NOFA itself. The NOFA has essentially three different categories of requirements. There are threshold requirements, which are a form of eligibility requirements If applicants fail to meet any of these requirements, they'll be deemed ineligible and they will not be evaluated. Then there are HUD-wide NOFA requirements. These are also eligibility requirements, and they apply not just to this NOFA, but to all HUD NOFAs. And then there are program-specific requirements. We have identified 19 requirements specific to Section 202 NOFA. 9 of them will require a specific submission of documents, which are itemized as tabs in the application. Starting off with threshold requirements, the first, most basic threshold requirement is timely submission. So applicants, again, applications must be submitted by midnight, before midnight on August 28th, 2019. Applications that come in after the state will be deemed ineligible. Applications must be complete. HUD reserves the right to determine whether an application is substantially deficient or non-responsive to the NOFA application requirements. Applications must come from private nonprofit organizations, or for mixed finance developments, the single asset for-profit limited partnership, of which one or more private nonprofit organizations hold a general partner interest. And then the final threshold requirement is need. HUD will assess the unmet housing needs in the proposed development area relative to the number of proposed assisted units. Applicants must provide an absorption ratio by dividing the number of units in the proposed project by the number of income-eligible households aged 62 years old or older with severe housing needs. To be eligible, sites must have an absorption ratio of 50% or less. Note that need shows up both as a threshold requirement, but then later also shows up as a rating factor, depending on the level of need identified in this calculation. There are a set of requirements that each applicant should review before submitting an application. These generally involve no separate submission requirements unless they're otherwise indicated in the NOFA. They're listed here: resolution of civil rights matters, outstanding delinquent federal debts, debarment and or suspensions, pre-selection review of performance, sufficiency of financial management systems, false statements, mandatory disclosure requirements, prohibition against lobbying, and equal participation of faith-based organizations in HUD programs and activities. Please review the website listed here to learn more about these. Now, with the 19 program-specific requirements that are listed in the NOFA, some require and describe specific submissions that must be made. We'll go through them in the next few slides. Starting with the project development plan, this is the basic proposal of the property description. That would include an address, the type of building, type of project, total units, and other information of that sort. It would identify the dates for the major development stages, when you expect funding to come in, when you expect construction to begin, and for construction to be completed. And then it also includes a statement of the applicant's ability to modify plans. This is really just an opportunity for the applicant to identify if the project could be modified to include less capital advance or PRAC units. And it would only come into play if we've identified a list of awards and would be able to make one additional award if the cost of that additional award could be modestly decreased. The next submission is the project development budget, which is the sources and uses, which identify which of the sources has been committed, and of course including the all non-capital advance funds. The construction cost must be based on a cost estimate performed by a professional estimator, or for rehab based on a capital needs assessment. It should identify, of course, the requested capital advance funds, and that amount cannot exceed the total development cost, which there is a link to those limits in the NOFA. And then all the sources must correspond, should align to answers in rating factor 3, where we're looking at sources of committed funds and leveraged funds. Next up, the applicant applicant must submit an operating pro forma, a 20-year cash flow pro forma, which should state any assumptions regarding the trending of revenue and expenses. And the revenue for the PRAC units, the initial revenue, must be consistent with the operating cost standards, which we've also posted on the HUD funding opportunities page, the initial operating cost standards. Next up, any applications that involve the rehab or acquisition of a property, i.e. not new construction, should be accompanied with a capital needs assessment, which should include a justification of the rehab costs being requested in the application, and of course, again, should be produced by a professional estimator. Next up, on environmental review, HUD will perform only a preliminary environmental screen at the application review stage in order to assess major adverse environmental conditions. To that end, applicants must submit environmental reports in a Phase 1 ESA and, if warranted, a Phase 2 ESA and a Phase 3 cleanup plan. Applicants are strongly encouraged to submit these items through HEROES, the environmental system in which these documents, through which these documents can be reviewed. HUD will reject, in its review of these items, HUD will reject applications where they're found to have major adverse environmental conditions that the applicant cannot reasonably mitigate. Subsequent to award, so if an application is selected, subsequent to the award, HUD will actually complete its full environmental review, which of course may find other items that need to be addressed, but they should not be major adverse conditions at that point. And at that point, use of HEROES will be required. So it may make sense, again, for applicants to use HEROES initially in the initial submission of the application. So also please note it takes a few weeks to get fully registered and signed up for HEROES. So if you plan to do that, it's worth registering soon. HUD's posted comprehensive environmental review guidance for this NOFA, as well as training on the HUD Exchange website, which is listed here, and is also listed in the NOFA. Moving on, the applicant must provide documentation of site control through either a deed or long-term leasehold, which evidences current title or leasehold interest in the site, through a contract of sale, or through an option to purchase, or for an option for a long-term leasehold. Next up, the applicant must disclose any encumbrances at the site and describe how any encumbrances will not adversely affect the use of the site for the 40-year capital advance period. And then next, on site neighborhood standards, all sites must comply with site selection requirements in 24 CFR 891.125. HUD will perform a specific site neighborhood standard review for any proposed new construction. Sites for new construction may not be located in an area of minority elderly concentration unless the site meets one of the allowable regulatory exceptions. We're requiring applicants to use a minority concentration analysis tool to determine if the site is in an area of minority concentration. I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Celia Carpentier, in the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, to talk in some greater detail on site neighborhood standards. Celia?
Okay, great. Thanks, Will. So these next few slides will go over the site neighborhood standards requirements for the Section 202 program relating to new construction in areas of minority elderly concentration. As Will mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this presentation is really just providing a brief overview of the requirements. We really encourage applicants to look at the site neighborhood standards requirements that are in the Section 202 regulations, as well as in the Section 202 NOFA. As Will mentioned earlier, we also did just post a question and answer document to the HUD funding opportunities page that goes more in depth on site neighborhood standards requirements. So the Section 202 regulations contain a specific analysis that must be conducted when proposing to do new construction of a Section 202 project in an area of minority elderly concentration. And while the regulation generally prohibits new construction in an area of minority elderly concentration, it makes two exceptions to this rule, and we'll go into these exceptions in the next couple of slides. But really, when determining what to submit as part of your NOFA application, the first question obviously is whether your project involves new construction. If it does not involve new construction, then you do not need to fill out this portion of the NOFA application. However, if you are proposing to do new construction, the first step would be to determine whether your proposed Section 202 project is in an area of minority elderly concentration. On the slides here, we do have the definition of area minority elderly concentration, so I'll just go through it quickly. It's a site that's located in a neighborhood that would have to meet at least one of these two conditions. So either the neighborhood's percentage of elderly persons of a particular racial or ethnic minority is at least 20 points higher than the percentage of elderly persons of that particular racial or ethnic minority in the housing market area as a whole. Or the second condition is when the neighborhood's total percentage of minority elderly persons is at least 20 points higher than the total percentage of minority elderly persons in the housing market area. So if your project is located in an area that meets one of these two definitions, it would be considered to be located in an area of minority elderly concentration. As Will mentioned earlier, we are providing a web-based minority concentration tool to help applicants determine whether their project is in an area of minority elderly concentration. What applicants will do is they'll go to this website and you can type in the address of your project and it'll do the calculation to determine whether your site meets one of these definitions. The link to the tool is currently on the HUD funding opportunities page, but we expect that it will be functioning, the tool will be up and running probably in the next few weeks. So once you have entered your project into the tool, you'll receive a report that will generate all of the demographic data for the racial and ethnic demographic groups both in the neighborhood and in the housing market area. And so the tool does this analysis based on census data and uses a census tract as an approximation for the neighborhood and uses the metropolitan statistical area or micropolitan statistical area or the county if they're not in one of those two areas as the housing market area. So when you go to the tool, you'll type in the address, it'll generate a report with the census demographics for both the census tract and the housing market area. So if you're doing new construction and you use the tool and it shows that your project is not located in an area of minority elderly concentration, in most cases, all you'll have to do is then submit that report as part of your NOFA application, and that report will show that it's not in a concentrated area. There are two circumstances when the tool might show that the project is not in a concentrated area, but you will need to, but we are requiring applicants to submit additional information in the NOFA application. And so these two circumstances are rare, but they do occur, so I will just go over them briefly. The first circumstance is if the proposed Section 202 project is technically located in a census tract that doesn't meet the definition of an area of minority elderly concentration, but it falls on the border of another census tract. So it's right when it kind of straddles two census tracts, or it's on the border between two census tracts, and the census tract that is bordering is an area of minority elderly concentration. The second circumstance would be where the proposed Section 202 project may be located in a census tract that is not concentrated, but really the census tract, it might be divided by a major geographic barrier, such as a river or interstate highway. And so in those cases, in both of these circumstances, it can be a sign that the census tract may not be an accurate representation of the neighborhood. So if this occurs, we would want the applicants to still submit the report showing the census tract data and showing that it's not concentrated, but we'll need some more supporting documentation to show that, in fact, despite these circumstances that the census tract is in fact an appropriate representation of the neighborhood, or the applicant will need this, may then also claim an alternative geography, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Show an alternative geography to show what the actual neighborhood boundaries look like. So let me see. If the project is, so we just went over what happens, or what an applicant should do if the tool is showing that the project is not in an area minority elderly concentration. But then in the next circumstance, if you type in your project and it is in an area minority elderly concentration, you will need to submit supporting documentation to show that your project meets one of two exceptions, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So you have the option of either providing documentation to show that it meets an exception, or you can claim an alternative geography, as I just mentioned before. And an alternative geography is where you would say that the census tract boundaries are not an accurate representation of neighborhood. If you go into the tool, you'll actually be able to draw your own neighborhood boundaries, and you could use the tool to do that and say, to draw the more appropriate neighborhood boundaries and generate a report that would have the demographic data for this alternative geography. If you choose to do this, we would ask you to submit that with your report, but you would still also need to submit supporting documentation that the neighborhood boundaries, the alternative geography, and the neighborhood boundaries for the alternative geography are generally accepted as the boundaries of the neighborhood. So like a way you could do this would be submitting supporting documentation such as planning, community development, or zoning maps, which have been adopted by a public jurisdiction that shows, yes, this is in fact the generally accepted boundaries of the neighborhood. But if your project is located in an area of minority elderly concentration and you feel that an alternative geography doesn't apply, that the site is in fact in an area of minority elderly concentration, you could still move forward with your project if you can show that the site meets one of the two regulatory exceptions that allows for new construction in an area of minority elderly concentration. So the two exceptions that are set forth in the regulation are either first, there are sufficient comparable opportunities exist for housing minority elderly households in the income range to be served by the proposed project outside of areas of minority concentration. Or the second exception is the project is necessary to meet overriding housing needs that cannot be met in that housing market area. We'll go over a brief overview of these exceptions, but please consult the Q&A that we just posted on the HUD Funding Opportunities page, which contains more information on the type of supporting documentation that should be submitted to show that the proposed Section 202 project meets one of these exceptions. So the first exception regarding sufficient comparable opportunities involves assessing the overall impact of HUD-assisted housing on the availability of housing choices for very low-income minority households, both in areas of minority concentration and outside areas of minority concentration. And it must take into the extent to which certain factors are present. And these factors are actually outlined in the Section 202 regulations, and which we discuss more in the Q&A document that we've posted online. So we really encourage you to look at those documents and to address those specific factors if you're claiming this exception. So please note that is not sufficient to show that there's maybe one or two comparable projects in the housing market area that are not in areas of minority elderly concentration. This really involves a comprehensive analysis of the comparable opportunities within the housing market area for low-income minority families. The second exception is regarding overriding housing needs may be met if the site is an integral part of an overall local strategy for the preservation or restoration of the immediate neighborhood. A Section 202 proposed project would generally meet this exception if it is located in a neighborhood with an official, currently operational, and realistically achievable plan for the revitalization of the neighborhood. So if an applicant is claiming this exception, it is usually a good idea to provide a link to the plan if the plan is publicly available, or even a copy of the plan, and to provide a summary of the various revitalization activities that are in the plan and that are targeted for the neighborhood, and a status update of each of these revitalization activities. The applicant may also meet the overriding housing needs exception if the proposed project is in a revitalizing area. So in order to show that a project is in a revitalizing area, we would encourage applicants to provide data to show that revitalization is occurring, such as the neighborhood is experiencing low or declining poverty rates or low or declining crime rates, or that the neighborhood is experiencing high or increasing household income or higher or increasing home values. The applicant may also provide evidence of significant public or private investment that has been made in the neighborhood recently. This can be things such as new retail or commercial development in the area that has had a revitalizing impact on the neighborhood. I also want to mention that the NOFA application, or the proposed Section 202 project, only needs to meet one of these applications, but applicants may choose to provide supporting documentation for both of these exceptions. An applicant may also choose to provide supporting documentation for an exception, but also may choose to propose using an alternative geography. So you can claim more than one. You only need to meet one of the exceptions, but you can provide documentation for more than one. And HUD will consider all of the information submitted to determine whether the Section 202 project meets the site neighborhood standards requirements. So I think that covers it. I'll turn it back over to Will.
Thank you so much, Celia. Just to emphasize for our listeners just how important it is to carefully consider the site location, as the site neighborhood standards review will make a big difference between whether an application is eligible under the NOFA and can move forward, or whether HUD is unable to make the award. So thank you again. We'll move on to the last program-specific requirement that requires the submission. This is related to the URA and the real property acquisition and relocation. Applicant must comply with the Uniform Relocation Act if the property was occupied at any time since the earlier of the publication of the NOFA and securing of site control. The applicant must state whether relocation did or would occur and must certify that the appropriate GIN, or General Information Notice, was issued. The applicant must also submit a relocation plan and budget in compliance with the URA if the development proposal will require the relocation of residents or businesses from an existing site. Okay, moving on to the other set of program-specific requirements. These don't have their standalone submission tabs, but however, they may impact what an applicant can submit. A number of these items are actually more relevant post-award, but I'll try to highlight here the items that might impact the applicant's submission. So first of all, applicants should identify any regulatory or programmatic barriers to completing their project as planned. And if there are, whatever special requests or waivers they're requesting of HUD should be submitted. However, given that no waiver request is guaranteed, the applicant should also demonstrate that the project could proceed even without that approval. Moving down, there are specific design and cost standards applicable to this NOFA. Properties that are developed, the PRAC units must be one-bedroom or efficiency units unless they're financed by other sources. Accessibility requirements in compliance with federal laws will, of course, apply. Properties must have smoke detectors. Commercial facilities must be funded from other sources. and properties developed under the SNOFA are subject to the broadband rule and must have broadband infrastructure unless they're accepted from the rule. There's a lengthy description of enhanced livability design standards in the SNOFA. And this is really important for applicants to pay attention to as it factors heavily into rating factor 1. In the context of housing for the elderly, enhancing the livability of the physical environment promotes housing stability and may prevent premature institutionalization into nursing homes. A well-situated, well-designed physical space at the unit and building level can help the elderly maintain independence and age in place longer. In addition to compliance with federal accessibility laws, HUD strongly encourages applicants to incorporate design standards that address fall prevention, enhanced accessibility features, visitability, universal design, and electronic communication mechanisms when developing housing and community facilities, and to consider access to transportation and walkability to the surrounding community and neighboring neighborhood services when they're selecting sites. And then moving down to the bottom of this list, Davis-Bacon will apply and therefore should be considered when estimating construction costs. Section 3, employment opportunities for low and very low-income persons will apply to any construction done under the SNOFA. There's even a rating factor point within rating factor 1 for Section 3 plans. And sponsors are encouraged to consider sites in opportunity zones, particularly where the acquisition and development supported by the Section 202 funds can contribute to an aggregation of public and private investment in urban and economically distressed communities. Okay, we'll now move on to discuss the 4 application rating factors. The 4 are listed here, and within each rating factor, they're subdivided into categories. So we'll take one at a time. The first rating factor is concept and project proposal. It's a total of 36 points, and it has a minimum score. Applications must earn a minimum score of 20 points in order to remain eligible for award. So the first component of this rating factor is physical design, which is 10 points. Applicants must clearly explain their building concept, how it will facilitate the delivery of services and accommodate the changing needs of the residents as they age in place and live independently for 10 to 20 years from initial occupancy. So within this rating factor, applicants should provide schematics of the building, and unit design, a narrative description of how the design will prolong the period that elderly residents with varying levels of health can live independently, and would address it at a minimum, no trip or zero-step entryways, lighting that promotes visibility, width of doors and hallways, emergency response systems, doorknobs that promote accessibility, such as levers, kitchen and bath features, and common areas, and things of that sort. Next up, within this category, there's supportive services, which provides another 10 points. Applicants are up to another 10 points. Applicants must clearly explain their supportive services plan, how it will accommodate the changing needs of the residents as they age in place over the next 10 to 20 years, how it will leverage the work of other providers of services to residents, if applicable, whether in partnership or through independent or complementary activities, and how service funding will remain stable over time. So within here, you describe the proposed supportive services, including a description of the public or private funds that are expected to fund the proposed services, as well as the way the services will be delivered. HUD will consider applicants' demonstrated ability, awareness of resources in the area, and capacity to partner with state and local healthcare agencies and/or service providers. Owners must commit to a plan to coordinate and adequately deliver supportive services, as well as to update and maintain their services plan every 3 years. Next, within concept and project proposal, up to 10 points are provided based on the soundness of the approach described here on physical design and supportive services. Applicants will provide compelling evidence that their physical design and supportive services plan will lead to better short and long-term outcomes for very low-income elderly to accommodate aging in place. So here, an applicant would provide evidence, either by citing research or stating a theory of change, as to why the proposed physical design features and supportive services plan will promote health, wellness, and quality of life, and will prolong the period that very low-income residents with varying levels of needs can live independently. Next, within this category, up to 5 points are provided based on replicability and scalability. So applicants will make a compelling argument here, supported by evidence-based practices, that their project concept can be feasibly replicated and scaled to produce more affordable housing options for the elderly to aging community in a limited federal funding environment. Again, here we're looking for projects that can act as a model, or at least as an incremental step towards formulation of a model for other improvements in building design, services provided, and financial structure, which stretch the value of HUD-covered services for very low-income elderly persons. And finally, in this rating factor 1, up to a point is provided for, based on the strength of planned activities towards fulfilling the goal of training and employing Section 3 residents or low-income residents and contracting with Section 3 business concerns in the development of the proposed project. Moving on to rating factor 2, which deals with the market in which the site is placed. Up to 14 points, excuse me, that's a typo, it should be 4 points, is provided based on the need of the site. So we spoke earlier about the absorption ratio, comparing the number of units created or proposed for development with the number of elderly in the community with severe housing needs as a threshold requirement. Here it comes in as a rating factor where points are provided to applications based on that absorption ratio. 4 points provided for an absorption ratio of 15% or less, 2 points if the absorption ratio is 15 to 30%, and and no points provided if it's between 30% and 50%. Then up to 10 points are provided based on neighborhood and context. So applicants must make a compelling argument that the location of the proposed project is well suited with respect to proximate amenities to meet the needs of an aging population. We're looking for applicants to demonstrate that the location of the site supports independence and or alleviates isolation. An applicant would identify the location, the proximity, and ease of access of the project site to amenities important to the elderly and that supplement the services provided on site, including things like healthcare and social service facilities, grocery stores, recreational facilities, and other things, and how residents could reasonably access those amenities. Moving on now to rating factor 3, which deals with capacity, project leverage, and committed funding. This is a total of 40 points, also with a minimum score across these categories, or across this rating factor of 20 points. The first category within rating factor 3 is development experience. Applicants must describe significant previous experience in providing housing to the proposed population generally, and significant previous experience implementing development activities with the types of financing proposed. So this will tie in to your sources and uses and how you're planning to develop the site. Should show how the scope, extent, and quality of the sponsors or their consultants' recent experience in developing and operating housing is consistent with the details of the proposed project, and include any rental housing projects and supportive service facilities that the applicant sponsored, owns, or operates in the description or firm resumes. The next category within this rating factor is supportive service experience. Applicants and or committed partners must describe and provide evidence of significant previous experience in providing and coordinating supportive services to the proposed population. So you'd show here how the scope, extent, and quality of the applicant's experience or of their committed partners, including property managers, in providing services is consistent with the details of the proposed supportive services plan. You'd identify specific services provided in their firm resumes and explain experience as well in HUD subsidy administration and our partners' experience in providing property management and coordinating supportive services. Next in this rating factor is project leverage of the 15 points provided based on the amount of financing brought to the project by the applicant in relation to the amount of capital advance funding that is requested in the application. The NOFA describes and provides examples of the leverage scoring. So please see the NOFA for more information there on on how points would be allocated. Next up, sources of funding. Here the applicant provides evidence that attainable sources of funds have been identified to cover all costs and that a substantial portion of total funding sources have been committed to the project. Here again, please see the NOFA for which sources we consider to be committed and which are not yet considered to be committed. What we're really after here is making sure that applicants' sources of funds are reasonable and attainable, and so we don't necessarily need lenders to have already, if the property is using a loan, for lenders to have committed funds, but that the loan could reasonably be secured for it to be considered committed under the score. And then the last category here is actually deduction of points based on past performance for sponsors that were awarded in the FY 2010-2011 capital advance round. Deductions could be made based on extensions granted and or amendment funds that were needed in those prior rounds. Finally, the last rating factor is on land use and zoning. Here up to 10 points are provided based on the status of the proposed site. 10 points are provided if the site is fully permitted and is fully permissible under applicable zoning ordinances or regulations. 4 points are provided if the zoning, if the property is partially permitted under applicable zoning ordinances or requires some other discretionary approvals. And then if the property is not land use compliant at all, 0 points. It doesn't disqualify the applicant, but the applicant must provide a statement of the steps needed to make the site permissible and the basis for the applicant's belief that the proposed action will be completed before the submission of the firm commitment application. Okay, now we'll briefly speak about, talk on application review and award process. So the application review and rating will be centrally managed at HUD headquarters. Unlike in the past, it will not occur at individual field offices. As we are reviewing the applications, there will be multiple steps, but we will be assessing whether any deficiencies identified in the applications are curable or non-curable. Curable deficiencies are ones that can be more technical in nature. Often they can be corrected by the applicant. They are not threshold requirements unless it's about the applicant's eligibility or their status as a nonprofit. It does not. Curable deficiency cannot be one that influences how the applicant is ranked or scored. So additional information that would impact the rating factors could not be given to HUD after the application due date. And there's a specific process for how curable deficiencies are communicated back and forth. They come through a certain specific mailbox, and that there are time limits for the applicant to respond to those cures. Non-curable deficiencies cannot be corrected by the applicant because correcting them would change the applicant's score or rank, and non-curable deficiencies may result in an application being ineligible or otherwise adversely affect an applicant's score, and final determination guidelines for narrative and other attachments. So The applications are due, as we've said a few times, on August 28th, 2019. Keep that date in your calendar. We expect to make announcement of the awards approximately 3 months after that application date. Applicants will be notified of the application decision by email to the person listed as the authorized owner representative, or AOR. We will make available application debriefings if requested for a period of 120 days, beginning 30 days after the public announcement of awards. A fund reservation award constitutes the preliminary approval of the application, so please remember that, and does not constitute an approval, full approval of the site. Once the award is made, then the applicant has to actually develop the property. Awarding of funds contingent on meeting the period of performance requirements that are listed in Section 2D of the NOFA, including the agreement letter, firm commitment application, and the start of construction timelines. All awards must follow general administrative requirements and terms for HUD financial assistance awards, and HUD always reserves the right to impose special conditions on award when assessing the applicant risk. So for example, if items are identified in the environmental screen that we want to make sure are addressed, the award might include a special condition to that effect. So at this point, we have some time for question and answer. Let's see what questions we have here that we were able to answer. If we're not able to answer the questions here, we'll do our best. We just remind folks after this webinar to submit their questions to our mailbox, which is 202 Capital Advance NOFA at HUD.gov. So let's see what questions we've received so far that we might be able to answer here. So one question is whether debt service is allowed when determining operating expenses under the PRAC. So PRAC contracts are not permitted to support debt, properties, there's no restriction under the SNOFA of developing mixed income or mixed use properties, and so if there are other sources of revenue at the properties that can support debt, that's fully allowable. We have a question about whether this PowerPoint and this webinar will be available after when we're done. Yes, we plan to post this recording as well as the PowerPoint on the HUD Funding Opportunities page so that you can re-review this training and for folks who were unable to attend today, that they too can view this training. We have a question, what geographical area is this opportunity for? This is a nationwide competition. So anyone, any location across the country is eligible to apply. There's a question, can you please confirm that funding cannot be applied to a licensed assisted living facility? That's correct. Assisted living facilities are not an allowed use of capital advance funds or the PRAC contract. There's a question, if the building is being built just for low-income seniors, will the entire project be eligible for PRAC? Yes, applicants can submit project proposals where the property is fully assisted by the PRAC contract with the intention of being leased to low-income seniors. or project proposal could have only a portion of the units covered under the PRAC, and other units possibly still serving seniors but not under the PRAC contract, or possibly serving other populations, other low-income families, or market rate or tax credit income eligible households. There's a question of what is the term of the PRAC that will be signed once the property is built. So the PRACs will be year-to-year contracts that will be that HUD will renew each year during the term of the capital advance use agreements. Programmatically behind the scenes, we're using annual appropriations to fund the assistance under the contract. The question, can you confirm for me where I can find the PRAC rents? So the PRAC rents, also called the operating cost standards, are available on the HUD Funding Opportunities webpage. Below the NOFA itself, there's a list of the operating cost standards and a few other documents, including the FAQs that will be there. The question, is there a maximum per unit award amount? So the maximum amount is dictated by the total development cost limits. There's a link in the NOFA to HUD's TDC, or total development cost limits, and that will inform the maximum amount of capital advance that could be requested. Question, will 202 capital advance work with the low-income housing tax credit program? Yes. So there are mixed finance rules around that have been promulgated by HUD over a decade ago around using tax credits with 202 capital advance. We anticipate that we and are encouraging the use of tax credits to help support the development of these properties. There's a question here about leveraging. So the NOFA says that the PRAC can only be used in capital advance units. Well, can the capital advance units also have the leverage funds in them, or do they have the only capital advance funds in these PRAC eligible units? So the property's development costs will be considered as a whole. So if there are PRAC units and other units at the property, and the capital advance is helping to support much of the development costs of the PRAC units, and other sources are supporting the cost of other units at the property, the leverage calculations will be done at the project-wide level. It won't be specific to the capital advance unit. Finally, there's a question about whether the PRAC units, once placed in service, will be eligible for conversion to a Section 8 contract under RAD that HUD's recently posted a draft section of the RAD notice that would describe the eligibility requirements for the conversion of existing 202 pracs. It does not impose any time restriction, and so if that were to become the final notice requirements, then properties once built and under a prac contract would be eligible for conversion under RAD. And then finally, because we have to wrap up now, but we're happy to address your questions through our email. If someone applies under the first NOFA and they're not selected, can they subsequently apply under the second NOFA, which we anticipate to publish after awards are made under this first NOFA? Yes, that there will be, applicants will be able to resubmit their applications or submit new applications or different project proposals under the second NOFA if they feel they would be competitive. And with that, unfortunately, we're out of time. We really appreciate those who are able to join. We encourage you to send your questions in to us. We will respond to them in as timely a fashion as possible. Thank you again for your participation.